Hello, I'm Chris Kissel. What I do is I'm a research vice president for IDC. I'm in part of the Worldwide Security and Trust Products Division. And the presentation I have for you today is called Establishing Your Cybersecurity Posture and then Moving Beyond Its Core. I've got an awful lot of stuff for you today. I'm fairly excited about the presentation. I could go through all these notes directly, but what I really want to do is I want to give you an idea of what the cybersecurity products and services. I want to give you an idea of what products do on the presenters, well, actually from the buyer's side and from the vendor's side. I want to give you an idea of what a good cybersecurity posture looks like. I also want to show you kind of what the future development of all of these things are. I'm pretty excited about our shared future, but there are some risks. And then ultimately, you'll see that I have some forecasts about some of the worldwide markets. Again, pretty optimistically excited about this presentation. I want to start with an affirmation. You know, for all the things that we have that are problematic in cybersecurity, people forget that we have a problem that we really do want. You know, when we designed our computers, our whole thing was to think of the internet as a way to get point-to-point communications. And we did that. We solved it maybe 25 years ago. We moved beyond the dial-up modems. We have cable. We have, you know, any kind of form of communication. The most important thing now, though, is at the edge, we can develop different applications. We have real-time telemetry, real-time compute power, and real-time analytics. So every time we do this, and we also have real-time access where we have people joining the network in real time, customers being able to buy online, we have contractors doing work, we have every kind of communications thing in the world at our disposal. The price of that, of course, is that every time we develop a digital transaction, we also develop a new adversary. And understand, though, on balance, we're ahead. It's kind of a critical time, though, because we see that breaches are coming and the breaches seem to be more and more frightening. And yes, the next wave is IoT, it's OT communications, and you hear the sound of 5G networks rumbling. This to me is the cybersecurity trends of 2023. And forgive me, I didn't get all of this completely correct as far as my automations go. But the singular most important one now, and we're starting from the lower left and we're going to build out, is the continued intensity around cybersecurity. Cybersecurity just seems to permeate. You know, almost immediately when you hear about a batch or a breach of like Log4j, or you hear about the Colonial Pipeline, or some of the things that happened last year with SolarWinds, immediately the problem seems to go not just to the Security Operations Center, it goes to the NOC, it goes to the board of directors, it goes to the line of business guys. And so as a matter of trust, companies have to have strong cybersecurity, not just for themselves, but for their clients. I think that we're finding in cybersecurity, growing and maintaining arcana is tough. I think about this all the time. We think about the tier 2 SOC 1 analyst, right? New guy, new girl, somebody good at their job, and then all of a sudden they get trained up and they're excellent at what they do. Well, they're kind of the person that gets poached. If you think about a local bank, Bank of America will be happy to get your best SOC analysts. And if they're not getting poached, they're getting burned out. So many of these things are so manually intensive. So the Great Resignation has hit cybersecurity as well. The problem is that when somebody leaves, their methodology seems to go with them. So I think our cybersecurity tools guys have to consider how to build dynamic playbooks, how to have application management embedded. All of these things can't go out the door when people leave. Ransomware has its own velocity. Well, we're learning that ransomware is prevalent, at different points at IDC, we actually see waves where it'll go from APAC, and then, 1 year it'll be prevalent in North America. But we do know that about half of the ransomware strains have two forms of malware families attached to it. The other half are simple malware. And even though ransomware seems very complicated, very often it's still phishing attacks or identity and access management breaches that started. We need quicker ephemeral response. So ransomware is fast enough. We're learning, though, that ransomware does have a dwell time, generally somewhere between 3 to 7 days. Just the same, when a ransomware attack starts, you need to shut all things down and get people back on a multi-factor authentication, or you need to throw a roadblock to where the ransomware is coming next. And you'd better, get going on your on your basic on your workbooks, on your reply. You got to get ready. Detection and response battle system royale. This is tough. We've got endpoint guys competing with SIM guys, competing with XDR, which we'll talk about, network intelligence and threat analytics. There is any number of ways to find an adversary, and unfortunately, those dollars are becoming more and more static. Risk matters, pick your battles. Every environment is going to have a significant amount of CVE scores. Again, that half idea, about half of devices will have a CVE problem with it, a common exposure, but that's not quite the same as which ones are really linked to malware in the wild and which ones are truly exploitable. And last, I want to present the idea of cybersecurity workflow shift through. So you have shift left. You've heard this, the idea of let's protect our DevOps environments. Let's protect the containers. And then you've heard of shift right. What are we going to do about having the adversary trying to do things after boom? Something goes bad. Do we have a proper digital resilience, and do we have backup plans? Can we stop something that happens right at boom? I'm going to argue that as part of the digital response playbook and part of the digital response answers, if you investigate something, your cybersecurity network has to be safer than the next time around. Quick example. Let's say that we find out that there's an S3 bucket exposure, pretty much limited to a certain kind of application, right? Well, while we're investigating all the S3 internet-facing application flaws for that one application, shouldn't we be able to go ahead and do the same sort of search for the rest of our network? And then the hopes are that when we patch all of this up or we put new policies in, that we aren't quite as dangerous the next time. We aren't quite as endangered the next time around. That's the idea of shift through. This is the year that was 2021. Now, in my Tier 2 SOC analytics service, I cover network intelligence. I think people more commonly call this network detection and response. Those are your Vectras, your Dark Traces, a couple other companies that are doing that kind of work. We cover the PCAP and network performance monitoring tools. That's your Riverbed, your Cisco secure networks analytics. That's ExtraHop. Emulation and deep packet insights are the kind of things that you get when you interrogate a file before it goes into the sandbox. It'll give you an indicator of compromise. Deception is exactly what it looks like. There's the idea that you could populate your registries, your Active Directory with decoys and phony files even. Security operations and response, security operations analytics and response, that's SOAR. And those are your Phantom / Splunk SOAR, your Palo Alto Networks Cortex SOAR, formerly Demisto. You have IBM, what was Resilient, and you have Swimlane as kind of the market leaders there. Firewall automation, that's sort of the idea of what a Tufin does. Now understand, if you buy a Palo Alto network stack, yes, they'll have automation between their firewalls. What I mean by firewall automation in this case is I'm thinking about when you have multiple firewalls in the stack. So you might have a checkpoint firewall, a Palo Alto, a Cisco firewall. Well, there's certainly a technology that will actually automate the rules across all of those. That technology is up. And then cloud native XDR, this is kind of complicated. This is what I track. This isn't just XDR. So in XDR, you've got all the endpoint guys, like you've got something like Cybereason or Symantec, Trend Micro, Sophos. That market we cover in modern endpoint, and that's covered by my colleague, Michael Suby. However, in the same cloud native XDR, you've got kind of a stack approach that's taken by Stellar Cyber, by SecureWorks, by ReliaQuest. That's my beat, and I think that's going to be a massively exploding industry in 2023. As you noted from the chart here, that basically the network intelligence guys had a terrific year. Darktrace, Vectra, and ExtraHop really grew in 2021. And more than anything else, that growth has sort of come into 2022, we believe. We're starting to put our tracker information for 1H 2022 together. Cisco a little more flat. But that idea of network detection response is resonating. And then, our big concern on the back end is where is inflation going to hit? And we're starting to see it. I mean, there's really, companies really do have to go to the penny to figure out, where does my security budget fit in with my overall IT budget? Where does it fit in the context of my overall business? If you remember when COVID hit from roughly, April through June of 2020, we had whole, slices of industries holding off on spending. If you think about hospitality or travel, it's not quite that severe, but it is more and more broad-based currently. And there is a security versus services, products versus managed services scenario coming up just ahead. All right, I want to talk about extended detection response. What makes it unique? Well, we've got SOAR, and SOAR is pretty strong. It does an awful lot towards being a central sprocket for basically all of the things that you want to put in there. If you have an endpoint and firewall telemetry, you want it to act a certain way, and you want to pull all these things together so that it will bring you a single version of the truth. The SOAR starts to do that, and it generates playbooks. The SIEM is a little more heavyweight than the SOAR. It has very strong telemetry for logs itself. But the problem is with both SIEM and SOAR is that it really is all log driven. XDR is the idea that endpoint detection response can be combined with network detection response, with user behavioral analytics, threat intelligence, and automated playbooks on one platform. There is more to threat. There's actually more to XDR. We're starting to think that a lot of identity logs will be put in there, and cloud work protection might be part of XDR. But the larger point of this idea is we want the real quickness of something that we see on an endpoint detection and response engine, something like a CrowdStrike, for instance. It says, hey, look, we could see memory corruption on your machine. We don't need to see that in logs. Let's do something now. Now that we see it on a machine, is this something to do with an application or an OS? Well, then we need to do that. We have to go back through the log backplane and figure out, if this is based on users or on applications or on machine type or C-level executives. And then we want to be able to put that back into an integrated workflow and measure it in the SOC and say, hey, we're getting better at detections over time. So that's what XDR is. And we're hoping that it's not as heavyweight as SIEM, but we're also hoping that it's a little more robust than SOAR, and we hope that it's ultimately as fast as EDR. You can see that, to me, this is kind of the fruition of several technologies coming through. The results are early. I've always said that if you were thinking of XDR right now, if it were a song, it's being sung, but we're still in the mixing stage. We're trying to make the things pretty and integrated and airworthy. All right. I want to talk about the four control planes that there are in cybersecurity. Now, I'm not going to say network. I'm not going to say cloud. I'm going to say that these are the things that have to happen for you to have control of. As we've mentioned, the endpoint. Obviously, there are distinct properties between the end user, the machine they use. You have to understand what is normal for an endpoint. And hopefully, if something goes haywire with a server, a router, or even a personal computer, you have that indicator of compromise, and that's your first action. Identity. I think I'm talking more of the idea of identity access, and it's still wildly important. You don't want people going onto the network that are unauthorized, and consequently, you also are going to have detection mechanisms for when somebody steals a password. It's not very uncommon. So that's where I think network intelligence has come in. The Vectras, the dark traces, all these guys looking for anomalies. That's kind of the last chance to look for an anomalous actor if they've acquired the proper credentials and look good otherwise. Applications are problematic. So what used to be a layer 7 probability is now a layer 3 one. Applications, person-to-person SaaS, those are pretty tough to corrupt. However, if they are corrupted, you can't see it because basically this comes up as an application. It isn't rinsed through your firewall or your perimeter. So at some point you have to have telemetry of either batch data or application data. And you also have to have an idea of what your application performance monitoring baselines are. So if something gets janky, then you know that it might be an indicator of compromise. And even more than that, applications have the second thing where if there is a performance lag, and this is also true with networks, it really hurts business. So if you think about an eBay, or you think about like basic transactional online transaction group like that, an Amazon, if they're having problems with their applications, buyers do things on impulse. Every second and millisecond loss is real dollars lost from the impulse buyer, right? And in a work thing where employees are always under deadline, if an application isn't working, they might cheat it. They might get off of the VPN and start doing workarounds. This guy right here may or may not be guilty of having done that. So let's just not tell anybody. My bosses aren't listening anyway. They never listen to me. Data. The most important thing about the data, of course, is you need to protect data at rest, in transit. You have to be able to protect, have encrypted data. You have to do all of this without incurring latencies. And also the other tricky thing about data is that, well, there's two things. One, again, like everything else, you have to have the right people accessing the right data. That's your safest thing that you can do. And then the second thing is that data can be lost. So if you see that there's some sort of drain, you need some data loss protection protocols, because it may look right. The packet sequences may look right. But if your file is supposed to be 4.5 megabytes and then it goes on the other end and it's 4.3 received, you got a problem. All right, here's what I kind of dug this about risk. I've been thinking about it lately, and I've also been thinking about the game. I think it's hilarious that there's only 4 things in the United States to capture, and you only get 4 armies if you do. So that's not quite right. And Kamchatka seems to be the most important territory you can take, but we'll leave that philosophy aside. Risk equals probable outcomes multiplied by potential damages, multiplied by possible indemnities, and then it's divided by the sum of prevention, security controls, mitigation, and recovery. So, I know that's said on an awful lot, but I want you to think about some of the classic things that you'll see in your network. Like you'll see a CVE score of 10 or a CVSS score from the MITRE framework, right? And that CVSS score of 10 tells you this is a real problem. But if there isn't any practical exploit out there, you really shouldn't, I'm not going to say not worry about it, but you have to push it aside. However, if you have a CVS score of 3, but it's on your web and email server, somebody's going to have to care about that. That is too much business to worry about. And then conversely, and I say this all the time, I'm a vice president, big head honcho, big deal, right? You steal my computer, you have almost $25 of intellectual property on it. But if you go to my admin and you take her computer, she has access to everything. So, the idea of what an asset is that's important, is also pertaining to what kind of data can be driven from it, what the loss of reputation for your company is. It's, risk is a little more than just the idea of, we can take something. And, and actually, in fairness to the CVSS idea, it's what can actually be stolen, what can be observed, and what can be altered, right? And all of those are bad outcomes. And so I have to tell you, it's a lot of math, and different people have parts of it that are pretty good, like the bit sites and security scorecard. They kind of have an outside-in looking perspective for different departments, and they can give you, hey, this is what your risk looks like from the outside looking in, and they could give you a score and quantify it. And then other people can actually look at the kind of ransomware type and go, wow, this is pretty fast or very dangerous. They could try to put a dollar figure on it. So risk is tough to track, but I think it's a better idea than, say, vulnerability. It's a better idea than, say, just solely attack path management, although all of those things still help and still matter. I say that risk reduction should be both ephemeral and permanent. So you have to do things to mitigate your risk that happens right away. But you have to do things that will stop the risk from happening the next time around. Sort of like what I was telling you about that shift through idea. And then risk is a shared responsibility, noting though that, actions far left of boom in your DevOps and your container are better than the things that you have to do to do digital recovery on the right-hand side. We're going to talk about, what an individual company should do as far as kind of thinking about how to secure their networks. But I want you to understand a couple of things. The answer is not static. First of all, an organization has to determine what its digital team must do. you've got, let's say you have a 2,000 person shop. You have basically 12 people doing IT, OT, and security. Well, do you want them to focus on, making sure that the website is up and running really well? Or do you want them to look on the back end and make sure that nobody's on the network? If you think about let's say you were thinking about something like a Bechtel, and they're larger than 2,000 people, but let's say a subsegment. Security is going to be more important to them because there's a whole OT application. You don't want a miscreant in water treatment plant or an nuclear power plant or something like that. But if you're something like Earl Scheib Paint Shop, you want to put all of your thing into presentation. You want to put things into where you could take customer billing. Security might not be quite as important. You have to determine how much your hunger for digital determinism is. Do you really want to do things through analytics? If you do, then you have that same CPU problem where you have only so many resources and so many hours in a day as you're devoting things to analytics, maybe to figure out what customer trends are or what, kind of things where you can find indicators of not indicators of compromise, but you might find something where machinery might be breaking down, or you might want to know something about your supply chain management. Whatever you do there kind of takes away from what you can do from security. So I'm kind of taking this paradigm from like a static workforce idea. And there's always hidden costs. So, if you think about a SIM, for instance, all that's great. But what happens if you were buying your SIM for 100 megabits or 100 events per second, and now you're at capacity? Firewalls work the same way. The problem is when you get at capacity, these machines don't work quite as well. And once you start letting packets in or dropping packets, you don't have true fidelity. So, there's got to be, and also if you think about deduplication of data, you can use one part of the data for analytics, the other part for IT security. But when you deduplicate it, the problem is you've now got twice as many pop costs. Might be worth it in some cases, and there's a lot of people who argue that it is because then you get the benefit of both ideas. But you have to account for that when you buy a machine or you buy a security platform. The time to deploy is an interesting thing. I think pre-pandemic, you would think of something like you would go into a SOC, you might have a 5 or 6 week trial period where you could say, hey, here's how well my SIM works, and they give you a range of IP addresses or a certain part of the network to work on. It doesn't exist right now. You pretty much, when you get that, when you get your platform in, whether it's endpoint identity, whether it's security networking, network detection and response, you kind of have to set the expectation, hey, this is what you get day one. A week from now, after we go through some of the algorithms, you get this much more, and you have to have it intuitive for people to work with it. So that part of it's important. Some of the security frameworks and fundamentals that go on here. Yeah, we're thinking about all of these security silos. And unfortunately, the syndicated research houses such as IDC and myself don't do you a ton of favors, because sometimes we have to put things in an endpoint bucket or a SIM bucket. Ultimately, though, your security is basically your surfaces and what an adversary can do to enter it. They don't care if you're strong or weak in endpoint. If you're weak there, that's where they'll go. If they see a hole in your identity and access management, that's what they'll do. If they see a two-hop path to your web server or your financial server, that's exactly what they'll do. They'll take the path of least resistance. Everything is now an edge. Remote workers represent an edge. I told you about the endpoint, the identity, the application, all those 4 control points. And I think I just mentioned 3. I can't think of the third one off the top, or the fourth one off the top of my head. Each of those still matter. Ultimately, performance matters too, for the reasons I said, earlier. You have a slow performing app or a network that's janky. If you have like an IP VPN type of arrangement for your phone calling, or IP networking for your telephony, and that's not working, then your communications are shuttered. So all these things add frustration, and all these things, no matter how much we want to siloize all of these, which I think is a word, is not really real. They have to be kind of thought of as an integrated stack altogether. All right, let me give you an idea of what I think is going to happen in my area of technologies going through to 2026. I think that the combination of network intelligence tools, network intelligence threat analytics tools, automation tools, automation and orchestration, and cloud native XDR will grow roughly 17.3% year over year. And I have put in I've tried to consider the idea of inflation. I'm not a super economist, and this thing could change 3 months from now, and I am scared of it. But that is to say that if inflation hadn't been such a factor 5 or 6 months ago, in the last 5 or 6 months, these numbers would be higher. I'm thinking about it more holistically. I'm thinking about it as the sum of the companies that are doing this work. So if you think about threat detection and response, you've got all these fine endpoint companies. You've got Trellix, CrowdStrike, Sophos, Symantec / Broadcom. You've got any number of strong SIM vendors. You've got, and SIM isn't in this, but they actually do play in it on the black backplane. You've got something like Splunk and IBM QRadar. So you've got those companies in there, and then you've got some IaaS support from Google, AWS, and Microsoft. No matter how it falls out, whether it comes into a network intelligence bucket or an XDR bucket or some sort of automation bucket, I'm fairly sure that it's going to sort itself all out. In my service later on, I have, not in this presentation, but I have to actually try to figure out which technology groups are going to win, and I have reasons for it, right? But, my whole idea is that you look at the sum of the problems and the companies that are in them and the current funding and current velocities, and those are the numbers I came up with. Let me tell you, in the near future, I think in 2023, XDR is going to have a big year. I'm thinking about big platforms. I'm thinking about Fortinet, Cisco, IBM. I think those guys have technology that they're ready to push, okay? And I also see that stack is changing, where deception and attack surface management are being integrated into the larger platforms. And then I see kind of in the 2024, 2025 range, where open XDR applies. So you'll start seeing really clever conversations between, I could tell you one right now, Cybereason and Google have like an idea for how you handle EDR, and then you get the investigatory parts of Google Cloud Platform. I think that's kind of the framework of what might happen next. You'll see a lot of, freestanding people on email and web defense, working with basically the EDR guys, working with SOAR guys, and then all of those going back through either a SIM backplane or more likely an IaaS backplane. And so that's where 2024 leads you. And then the last one is 2025 and 2026. What is happening in security, interestingly, is that automation is good enough right now. So I don't mean it's phenomenal, but you've always had these managed detection and response companies. That would be your Alert Logics, your eSentiders. There's several others, but the way I'm thinking about them is Arctic Wolf. The way I'm thinking about them is their kind of model was based on each analyst might have 30 to 50 clients. It might be able to convict an alert and tell you what to do within 3 hours. The automation backplane on all of these interconnected devices is just better than that. So it turns out where they could either charge more for better SLAs, or they can have one analyst handle more accounts. So the idea of MDR coming down to mid-sized businesses or small businesses is not too fantastic anymore. And in fact, I think 2025, 2026 might be the time for that. We've got about 5 more slides, and I'm whizzing along, and I'm giving you, non-essential information, but you had nothing better to do. So I'm hoping you're enjoying it anyway. The term that everybody uses is SASE, which is Secure Access Services Edge. We kind of caution at IDC, we call it pervasive application edge defense. And we're not doing that to be argumentative or different. Really, there's about 2 or 3 things that SASE does that really are separate. So one of them is the probabilistic thing about what happens between ingress and egress at the access points, right? When you go from your premise or the individual user to cloud. The second thing too is the formal microsegmentation or SD-WAN that people actually call it. So zero trust is part of that. zero trust, microsegmentation. Those are ideas. CASB is an interlude between network and individual users. Those would basically be the physical construct of the SASE. And then there's the third backplane where analytics kind of come in, and you go, well, based on this, what we're seeing in the firewall, there's a decision to be made about whether we investigate an incident or not. So really, SASE is like three big technologies put together, and most companies can do two of the three good, or in some cases, two really good and one pretty well. But, when people tell you about SASE, consider, always go back to that idea of the four control planes or four control points. And am I protecting all four of those properly? Whatever the other acronyms are, there's the zero trust idea, and then the four control planes, and you kind of work with it. What to know about application security? Application explosion drives the API economic or ecosystem complexity. With more automation, code reuse, and shorter development cycles, applications are more common and numerous than ever. Modern design practice and cloud-native tooling have made API ecosystems more complex than ever as well. The upshot of this application explosion is that the increased dependence on APIs for efficient communication. All that sounds good. And all of it's necessary. We actually think that when companies think of themselves now, they're as much developers as they are anything else. They have to be agile. You have to do things in real time sometimes that you're not wholly comfortable with. Again, the problem is that if you don't have the right open source software, like for instance, well, it's not even necessarily open source, but in any software development environment, a big chunk of that code is going to be open source. And so if you don't constantly revise what your best, what the current application is, the safest, most vetted one, you cause a problem there. If an application is put in a bad place, if it's in a vulnerable server, it can be messed with. You can create problems for it. And so we know that there's a couple of things that are a little bit different about applications and DevOps. APIs, though, are special. Ideally, an API security would be sufficiently addressed through secure development practices. I was kind of mentioning that. An implementation of an API gateway or a web application firewall protection, or some combination of all this. APIs are complex. They do involve new threat vectors, and they're not always recognizable in the developmental stages or in the API. And, a good example of that was, unfortunately, the SolarWinds breach, where you had an application that had about 1 million lines of code, and really only about, I think they said a couple hundred lines were really altered, but that changed everything. They were in the right place in the code, and that gave people that had the agent exposure and visibility to what machines and what environments it was on. So that isn't easily detected, in the gateway. It isn't easily detected on a firewall. And then last, it's all about access. I would say that, the one debate about SASE that can be had, and I remember this argument that then EMC Dell about 4 years ago would say, is they said, well, you can go ahead and get Office 365, for instance, as a direct, user to Microsoft Cloud as an application, or you could host it on your own private cloud at, some fraction of the cost, because you would have the master design of it, and you could set your own ingress and egress to the application through the VPN or through your own data security protocols. So, while it's there's really a good feeling about working straight with vendors to get applications, to get software as a service, there's also something to be said about doing it through your own area. And like the last one where I had these automations, for some reason I decided to put in 4, 3, 1, 2. All right, so let's just pull them all together. These are the sensibilities your cybersecurity vendors would better understand, whether they are a company, service, platform, point product, or feature. We went through this with deception. Deception had been you had discrete companies like a TiVo. You still have a Calvio, TrapX. A lot of these companies were purchased because they provided visibility and proactivity into cybersecurity. We have to, when you're thinking about your product or as a company, you have to understand, am I going to become a feature set, or am I going to become something that's part of a larger set? When you have a cybersecurity appliance, you better explain exactly what it does. Does it prevent malware? Does it help with your mean time to detect? Will it stop phishing attacks? Does it probabilistically explain the risk to an individual machine? Those are the things you want to know. If you're a vendor, when you're presenting to a buyer, that's the thing. Tell the buyer what happens at capacity. If you need more bandwidth, can you purchase it? If you need more security hours, can you get those? If you need some consultation, what happens when we're at the edge of our agreement? And that goes into declaring what the ancillary support will be included. You have to be ready to roll into a proprietary or an open stack agreement. I'm thinking about the web and email guys, like the proof points. Do they want to become a XDR stack, or do they want to become part of a backplane of that open XDR that I was talking about? I don't know that they necessarily make the choice, but they have to be able to do both. And I'm not picking on Proofpoint any more than I'm picking on any other web and email provider. That was just the one that came to mind. Low code, no code usability. You can't have people writing code and using your product too. It's on the vendor side to take as much of that off of you as possible. And then buyers are going to want fewer security vendors. If you think it's onerous with, training, finding individual people to be in your SOC, right? We kind of agree that there's been turnover with all of that. The big problem is that, is it easier to train somebody on 20 applications or 20 point products or 15? Is it easier to keep buying things yearly or as a SaaS 20 times or 15? So there is, I think that there's a point here where the best of breed point product guys are a little bit challenged because there has been an identifiable move more towards platforms. We're down to a few precious slides. As I'd suggested before, for your cybersecurity solutions, the platform has to be touchless. Your end user has to be able to use the screens intuitively. They really can't write code. If you are a fan of drag and drop, you're great. There are hardcore metrics involved, including return on investment, mean time to detect, and mean time to respond. It's also about the use cases and the technologies. As I said earlier, really, we're trying to stop the adversary. Really, we're trying to make sure the application is safe. Really, we're trying to make sure that their blast surface is mitigated. If somebody does intrude the network, they have real trouble moving. There's friction at all points. Those are the questions. It's not, hey, we're the best endpoint guys around, or this is the other things that we do. Risk trust and digital transformation are not benign considerations, right? We talked about risk. Trust is the amount of redundancy and encryption applied. Trust is a little bit tricky. Now, remember, if we think about a full zero trust model, right? Every application should be fully encrypted and then decrypted when it's handed off. Every user should have to multi-factor authenticate, and that doesn't feel practical all the time. So you do have to kind of consider that there's trade-offs between some of the things that work for zero trust and least privilege access, but also introduce latency. And the digital transformation matters too, where when I was talking about the idea of deduplication, where you have all these logs and this information, you might want to consider what that means for line of business, what kind of analytics can be applied, but you also have to consider what kind of security that it brings or better network performance. All these things are tied in. And then as I'd explained, my new word, I'm trying to get shift through to work, right? And I've got a couple of different papers I've written. It isn't so much that you see something one time. It isn't something that you prevent something. And it's not something that you've just created a patch and a strong remediation. It's that every time you go through this cycle, every way you construct your network, all the tools that you buy are designed so that when you do something once, it has a force multiplier on down the line. Your security posture is better the next time, okay? And so this is my last slide other than the vanity slide at the end. Let's think about cyber resilience, okay? So we want to verify software, firmware, and information integrity through integrity checking mechanisms. From time to time, you want to make sure that you check how efficient your SOC is. Some of the guys at the breach attack simulation, the idea that you would run a breach through it if you'd heard about a specific breach, and then find out, did your firewall pick it up, your endpoint, your SIM, did they pick it up? You want to have the same exercise for firmware. You also want to make sure that you have some sort of way to check your data in rest and in transit and in motion, right? Establish resilience requirements to support delivery of critical services for all operating states. Yeah, you have to have resiliency when you're at peak hours. You have to have things like, and you'll see it in the next point, fail safe and load balancing and ways to hot swap. The idea is that you have to account for normal and adverse situations. You want to conduct, maintain, and test backups of information. It's one thing to say, look, I've got a really nice resilient thing. I have data recovery, disaster recovery systems in place. Every now and then you're going to want to at least set aside a sliver of your network to check to see that that's good. You're also want to do some red testing from time to time. Interestingly, some of these software guys are developing automated red testing, but a formal or a red team test is still not a bad way to go to find out things about your network you couldn't find in software. You want to verify hardware integrity through integrity checking mechanisms. The same thing with, like your servers and your routers. Make sure that they're still working at capacity. When we started this meeting, I'm working with a tech, and he tells me, he goes, we got to find out how fast your uplink and downlink speeds are. That's the idea. Maintain adequate system capacity to ensure availability. Yep, you don't want to, if you have a, if you kind of work with fiber, or you're working through a, some sort of whatever your bandwidth compliance is, or is satellite or whatever, you want to leave some headway for CPU so that if you have to expand for burst conditions, you can do it. Or if you have extensible things that are usually positive, you acquired a whole bunch of new customers, or you have a couple of new applications that you're installing, you have to be able to do all of that safely. So look, man, I'm Chris Kissel. I'm Research Vice President, Cloud Native XDR and Tier 2 SOC Analytics. You can find me through this or through my probation officer. Either one will work. I'm largely optimistic about some of the cybersecurity things that are happening. Not as excited about some of the microeconomics, and of course, fearful that the world is a little more dangerous right now. I'm not going to go into a big political thing, but obviously the Russian-Ukraine war can cause some food shortages. It makes us think differently about our world. In any event, though, I expect that you should be well. Act generously in your dealings. That's actually a big part of all this thing I was trying to say about, how to help people when they're at capacity, or what kind of support that you can offer when they install things. Generosity is kind of a big thing in this. And thank you for looking and listening. Be well.